Why does Wales seem to appear only at the edges of British history? Always resisting, rarely defining the story. For centuries, Wales is treated as a footnote, conquered by Rome, overshadowed by England, remembered mainly for rebellion. But that version misses something essential. This documentary begins with a different question. How did Wales survive as a distinct people for over 2,000 years? Despite invasion, fragmentation, and political defeat. We'll follow the story from Iron Age societies and Roman rule, through the collapse of Imperial Britain, the rise of Welsh kingdoms, and the long struggle with a more powerful neighbor. Understanding the history of Wales helps solve a larger problem in British history. It explains why Britain was never a single story, why resistance did not always mean failure, and how a nation could lose its independence yet refuse to disappear. This is not the history of a defeated land, but of a stubborn one. When the ice receded, people followed meltwater and animals into a land shaped by ridges, valleys, and wide tidal flats. Groups moved along river corridors like the Severn and the Dee, camped near sheltered coves on the west coast, and exploited the mixed woodland that covered much of the interior. They did not anchor themselves in permanent villages. Instead, they moved with purpose, carrying fire-making skills and compact toolkits, returning to productive fishing weirs, shell beds, and nut groves when seasons aligned. Red deer and wild boar ranged through forests. Salmon and eels filled rivers. Estuaries offered shellfish in abundance. Life followed migration, tide tables, and plant cycles rather than fixed boundaries. One of the earliest traces of people in Wales appears in a limestone chamber overlooking the Bristol Channel. Pavilan Cave. The burial found there, stained with red ochre, signals more than endurance. It suggests ritual, identity, and deliberate treatment of the dead. Ochre had to be sourced, prepared, and applied with intent. The body was positioned, objects placed. Even in an Ice Age landscape, people invested meaning in death and place. Caves facing the sea may have held stories, their entrances marking a threshold between everyday movement and ceremonial space. As temperatures rose during the Mesolithic, shorelines shifted and sea levels climbed. Communities adapted by remaining flexible. They refined flint-knapping techniques to produce microliths, small bladelets, set into wood or bone to form composite tools. These were light, replaceable, and suited to frequent travel. Seasonal rounds carried groups from berry-rich woodland to exposed headlands where seals hauled out, and to river mouths timed precisely for fish runs. Footprints preserved in intertidal mud and trackways pressed into peat record regular routes across marshland, showing detailed knowledge of tides and safe crossings. Shell middens accumulated along the coast, marking places used again and again over generations. Around 4000 BC, farming spread into Welsh valleys and coastal plains. Forest was cleared in patches, sometimes by burning or ring-barking trees, and cereals such as emmer and barley were planted. Domesticated cattle, sheep, and pigs brought predictable food supplies and encouraged longer stays in one place. Houses shifted from temporary shelters to timber-built structures. Field systems appeared on slopes, turning hillsides into managed plots, while lowland enclosures protected crops and livestock. Pollen cores from bogs record these changes clearly. Tree species decline as grasses and cereal pollen increase, tracing the transition from wildwood to farmed land. Monuments followed settlement. Across Pembrokeshire, Anglesey, and the north, communities raised dolmens and passage tombs aligned to sun or moon events. Sites such as Pentre Ifan and Bryn Celli Dudu combined engineering with intention. Massive capstones balanced on uprights, chambers oriented so light reached interior spaces at specific times of year. These were not isolated graves. They were gathering points that fixed memory, ceremony, and identity to the landscape. Lines between monuments likely guided movement across uplands while signaling territorial presence. From the Prehistoric Hills, groups quarried dense bluestone. Some of these stones traveled far, ultimately appearing on Salisbury Plain at Stonehenge. Transporting multi-ton blocks across bogs and rivers required planning, labor, and cooperation across communities. Sledges, rollers, hauling teams, and staging points reveal networks of trust and obligation that stretched well beyond a single valley. The coastline itself was changing. Rising seas submerged low-lying land, drowning forests and camps that once stood at the edge of dry ground. Today, tree stumps and peat beds visible offshore mark landscapes that Mesolithic people once walked. Entire routes now lie beneath the Irish Sea. These transitions, from mobile foraging to farming and monument building, set durable patterns. Fixed fields, marked gathering places, and territorial memory created local loyalties and boundaries. Those foundations shaped the power structures that would emerge in the Bronze Age, where land, resources, and identity became something worth defending. Bronze arrived not as a single invention, but as a new way of organizing power. Communities learned how to mix copper with tin, control heat, and pour metal into stone or clay molds. The result was harder tools and sharper weapons, but also something less visible. Authority concentrated around those who controlled knowledge. Axes cut deeper into forest soils, sickles lasted longer in the fields, and spearheads could be repaired rather than discarded. Metal objects circulated through cycles of use, breakage, and reforging, binding daily labor to specialist skill. Access to raw materials reshaped landscapes. Copper from places such as the Great Orme, gold from streams and veins, and later iron from bogs and hills tied inland valleys to coastal routes. Ingots and finished objects moved along rivers and across headlands, linking Welsh communities into wider Atlantic exchange networks. Elites emerged where individuals could manage mines, command skilled workers, and host feasts that redistributed metal and food. Gifts created obligation. Obligation created followings. Power rested less on territory alone and more on the ability to control flows of material and reward loyalty. By the later Bronze Age, ironworking spread. Bloomery furnaces produced spongy masses of metal that smiths hammered into tools and weapons. Iron ore was more common than copper or tin, so blades and fittings became widespread. But the knowledge to smelt and forge kept specialists influential. Iron knives, spearheads, and agricultural tools improved durability and reach. Wagon fittings and harness components expanded mobility, allowing goods, people, and animals to move more efficiently between uplands and lowlands. Geography continued to shape political identity. In the south and along the borderlands, the Silures formed around corridors such as the Usk and Wye, controlling river crossings and fertile mixed farmland. In the central and northern uplands, the Ordovices occupied steep terrain, high pasture, and narrow passes that favored herding and defensive retreat. To the northeast, The Dishangli looked toward the Dee estuary and coastal exchange. Watersheds, ridges, and river systems encouraged independence, short-range rivalry, and strong local identities rather than centralized rule. Hill forts multiplied across Wales. Builders crowned spurs and hilltops with ramparts and ditches, sometimes layered in multiple lines of defense. Inside stood roundhouses, raised granaries, livestock pens, and open yards used for markets and assemblies. Gateways controlled movement and visibility. These sites were not only refuges in war, they organized storage, trade, and decision-making. More than 600 hill forts are known in Wales, forming a dense network that reveals how communities valued height, surveillance, and statement as much as security. Daily life revolved around timber roundhouses with central hearths and thatched or turf roofs. Fields produced barley and emmer. Gardens supplied pulses and greens. Herds stored wealth. Cattle signaled status. Sheep provided wool and meat. And pigs offered quick returns. Rotary querns replaced earlier grinding methods, easing food preparation. Weapons were common but not constant. Spears, shields, and blades belonged to a culture where defense, raiding, and escorting goods blurred together. No single ruler unified these societies before Rome. Authority rested with kin groups and leaders who could gather followers, defend routes, and redistribute surplus. That fragmentation, combined with difficult terrain and valuable metals, made Wales both attractive and resistant to outside power. Any force seeking control would face not one enemy, but many, each shaped by land that rewarded endurance and local knowledge. Rome moved into Wales only after securing southeastern Britain because the terrain resisted speed. Steep ridges, boggy uplands, and narrow valleys broke formations and strained supply lines. Settlements were scattered and often elevated, offering few central towns whose capture could deliver rapid control. Local groups remained mobile, knew every ford and pass, and avoided decisive confrontation. Roman commanders learned quickly that Wales would not fall to a single campaign. Progress meant grinding advances valley by valley, hill by hill. To meet that challenge, the army shifted from movement to permanence. Forts were established at key points and linked by roads that allowed troops, animals, and supplies to move predictably. Smaller auxiliary forts screened the uplands while legions occupied larger bases capable of supporting long-term occupation. Patrols mapped routes, guarded river crossings, and built signal systems that turned high ground into surveillance networks. Instead of chasing resistance endlessly, Rome aimed to contain it. The core of this system in the south was Isca Augusta. This legionary fortress housed thousands of soldiers with barracks, baths, workshops, and headquarters laid out to imperial standard. From here, troops could move up the Usk and Wye valleys and reinforce interior positions. In the northwest, Saguntium guarded approaches to Anglesey and the Menai Strait. These strongholds did not anchor large civilian cities. Instead, they projected military authority across regions that remained culturally distinct. Roads stitched the system together. Routes such as Sarn Helen followed ridges and valleys, cutting through difficult terrain with causeways and engineered gradients. Milestones fixed distance, bridges secured crossings, and official stopping points regulated travel. These roads imposed new rhythms on movement, commerce, and administration. Even after imperial control faded, many remained the easiest ways through the landscape, guiding travel for centuries. Roman material culture arrived with the garrisons. Stone and tile replaced timber in forts' means. Bathhouses introduced regulated social space. Coinage standardized payment and taxation. Writing entered daily life through inscriptions, tablets, and accounts. Roman law governed contracts and disputes where state authority reached. Yet, urbanization remained thin. Outside a few villa estates in fertile lowlands, most communities retained older settlement patterns, incorporating Roman goods without abandoning local identities. Wales mattered economically for its resources. Gold, lead, and silver were extracted under military oversight. Mining operations cut galleries into hillsides, drained water with wooden channels, and processed ore near fuel and transport routes. These materials supported imperial finances and military supply, tying remote districts directly into the needs of the empire. Roads and ports carried metals outward, while soldiers enforced control inward. The garrisons themselves were diverse. Units stationed in Wales included recruits from across the empire, bringing different languages, customs, and gods. Altars and inscriptions attest to a range of beliefs practiced within the discipline of military life. Wales became a frontier province not because it lacked value, but because it required constant attention. From the late 3rd century onward, that attention weakened. Troops were withdrawn to meet crises elsewhere. Road maintenance declined and coin supply faltered. Forts contracted or were abandoned. Local leaders stepped back into roles once filled by imperial officials, managing land, justice, and defense. By around 410, Roman administration in Britain collapsed. In Wales, the military lattice dissolved, leaving behind roads, ruins, and a population already accustomed to governing itself at the margins of empire. When imperial administration unraveled around 410, the systems that had paid soldiers, enforced law, and maintained roads stopped working almost at once. Tax collection faded, official correspondence fell silent, and garrisons no longer answered to a central command. Communities still needed protection and arbitration, but now those responsibilities fell to local leaders. Authority shifted away from imperial offices and toward individuals who controlled land, food stores, and armed followers. Former officers, estate holders, and local war leaders converted practical power into inherited status. A man who could defend a valley, organize harvest labor, and resolve disputes gathered a retinue. Over time, that role hardened into kingship. Leadership passed within kin groups, first by consensus and later by custom. Warbands answered to household lords rather than distant governors, and assemblies met at halls, church sites, or noted hilltops where tribute was distributed and judgments announced. 3 major kingdoms emerged along lines suggested by geography. Gwynedd took shape in the northwest, protected by the mountains of Eryri and the Men-Ai Strait, with control over key coastal routes. Powys developed across the central borderlands and the upper Severn Basin, linking hill pasture to fertile river valleys. Dyfed formed in the southwest, anchored by sheltered harbors and inland ridges that directed movement between coast and interior. Watersheds and estuaries defined borders as effectively as any formal boundary. Pressure came from multiple directions. To the west, settlers and raiders from Ireland crossed the sea, especially into Dyfed, where some integrated into local elites through marriage and service. These connections brought new ties rather than simple displacement, folding Irish influence into local politics. To the east, Anglo-Saxon groups advanced along river routes, testing defenses and probing lowland farms. These movements fixed priorities for Welsh rulers: secure crossings, guard estuaries, and maintain access between upland pasture and arable land. Roman habits did not vanish. Latin persisted in inscriptions and early charters tied to church foundations. Roads continued to shape travel and levy points. Former forts were reused as compounds, storehouses, or assembly sites. Christianity, present since late Roman times, expanded under royal patronage. Churches and monasteries preserved literacy, recorded genealogies, and provided burial grounds that reinforced claims to legitimacy. A king's association with a sacred site strengthened his authority and linked him to wider networks of learning and law. Conflict remained frequent but small in scale. Raids for cattle, hostages, and tribute mattered more than decisive battles. Leaders relied on swift marches, local knowledge, and personal loyalty rather than mass armies. Alliances shifted with marriages and seasons. Reputation mattered. Poets and genealogists preserved names and deeds, translating success into recruits and political weight. Claims to ancestry became tools of rule. Lineages traced descent to Roman officials or legendary figures, binding imperial memory to native tradition. These stories did more than flatter. They justified authority in a world where written law was thin and personal ties mattered most. Among the emerging kingdoms, the northern realm, sheltered by mountains and sea, possessed the defensive depth and cohesion needed to exert influence beyond its borders, setting the stage for a rise in power that would reshape Welsh politics. Gwyned's strength began with geography. The mountains of Eryri narrowed approaches to a few steep passes, while dense woodlands slowed movement and favored ambush. The Men-Ai Strait and the broken coastline allowed sea travel but discouraged large-scale landings. Armies could not move quickly or feed themselves easily in this terrain. That constraint mattered. It gave local rulers time. Time to choose where to fight, when to withdraw, and how to protect stores. Over generations, control of pace became a form of power. Early rulers organized authority around this landscape. They linked ridge strongholds to river mouths and monitored fertile lowlands where sea routes met arable land. Anglesea's fields supplied grain and cattle. Mainland valleys provided timber, iron, and manpower. Whoever held the crossings of the Men-Ai Strait and the nodes around Arfon and Lun could collect dues, regulate grazing, and patrol the coast. Power settled into households that guarded these points year-round, and retinues grew around courts that stored surplus and dispensed judgment. By the 6th century, Gwynedd functioned less like a loose alliance and more like a stable kingship. Authority passed within dynasties rather than shifting between rival war leaders. Assemblies met regularly, tribute moved along predictable routes, and obligations hardened into expectation. This stability did not end conflict, but it allowed rulers to plan beyond a single campaigning season. One figure came to embody this reach. Gwynedd. Contemporary sources remembered him not only for power at home, but for influence across Wales and beyond. He intervened in disputes, placed allies in neighboring courts, and used naval movement along the north coast to project force. His reputation traveled ahead of his armies, making negotiation as effective as battle. Claims that he was the most powerful ruler in Britain during his lifetime reflect how far his authority extended beyond his core lands. Expansion relied on leverage rather than occupation. Gwynedd preferred layered pressure. Marriage turned frontier leaders into clients. Tribute secured access to pasture and ports without garrisoning hostile ground. Raids reminded neighbors of consequences, followed by envoys who offered terms. Control of one valley head could offset resistance in the next. When force was needed, ships crossed the Menai quickly, striking and withdrawing before coalitions formed. Christian institutions became part of governance. Monasteries and churches managed land, trained clerics, and preserved literacy. Kings granted protection and endowments. Clerics provided legal knowledge, record-keeping, and moral authority. Churchyards served as safe assembly places, and burial near a sacred site reinforced dynastic legitimacy. Religious networks also carried messages and alliances beyond Gwynedd, linking the kingdom to Ireland and Western Britain. Ancestry mattered as much as territory. Gwynedd's rulers traced descent to Roman officers and heroic figures from British tradition. These genealogies bridged imperial memory and native custom, asserting continuity and right to rule. Law, poetry, and language reinforced the claim. Poets celebrated lineages and land rights. Jurists preserved customary practice. Everyday speech remained stable even as regions farther east shifted linguistically. As Anglo-Saxon power expanded across Britain, Gwynedd preserved a cultural and political center in the west. Courts sponsored poets, upheld native law, and maintained production through maritime links. That prominence also invited challenge. Neighboring Welsh kingdoms tested boundaries, and rival alliances formed to check northern influence. The tools forged in this period: geographic control, dynastic authority, and legal tradition would be tested repeatedly as pressure mounted along the borderlands. Powys occupied the eastern edge of Wales, stretched across the upper Severn Basin and valleys that opened toward the English lowlands. This position brought opportunity and danger in equal measure. Broad floodplains supported grain and pasture, and river routes connected communities to wider exchange. But the same openness exposed settlements to movement from the east. Unlike kingdoms shielded by mountains or sea, Powys faced approaches where armies could march, graze, and resupply with relative ease. Defense here required constant vigilance. As Anglo-Saxon power consolidated beyond the border, Powys became Wales's first line of resistance. Its rulers monitored river crossings, patrolled ridgelines, and sent warnings west when forces gathered across the Severn or Dee. The kingdom acted as a buffer between expanding English territories and the Welsh heartlands. That role demanded balance. Too much resistance invited destruction. Too much accommodation risked erosion of authority. Policy shifted with harvests, alliances, and the strength of neighboring courts. The land itself drew conflict. Fertile valleys and winter fodder made Powys attractive to raiders. Farmsteads clustered near rivers, mills, and old Roman trackways where trade made sense. But those same routes guided attackers. A mounted band could descend a side valley, drive off cattle, and retreat across a watershed before defenders assembled. Communities invested in hedges, enclosures, and storage pits, slowing raids but rarely stopping them outright. Life along the border revolved around alarms and retaliation. Leaders trained companions for rapid movement and ambush rather than set-piece battle. Dawn attacks on corrals or supply wagons mattered as much as clashes between armed bands. Herds were wealth, food, and status, so their loss struck deep. Poets recorded these struggles, praising endurance and sharp counterstrikes, turning survival itself into a mark of honor. The most visible statement of this frontier was Offa's Dyke. Running along high ground between river valleys, it projected power and intent. The bank faced west, the ditch east, asserting control without sealing the border completely. Gates, gaps, and bends show it was a claim on the landscape rather than an impenetrable wall. Movement continued, but under watch, tolls, and threat. Powys resisted when it could and yielded when it had to. Some rulers led coalitions that checked advances along river corridors. Others accepted tribute or ceded grazing rights to buy time. Authority rose and fell with individuals, and long-term stability proved elusive. Pressure along the eastern front drained attention and resources, limiting Powys's ability to dominate Welsh politics as a whole. Yet culture held. Welsh speech, law, and custom remained embedded in daily life. Churches anchored literacy and dispute resolution, genealogies preserved claims to land and status. Even under constant strain, identity endured. As Powys absorbed the cost of border defense, western and southern kingdoms gained space to consolidate, setting the stage for new centers of power to emerge beyond the marches. Dyfed occupied the southwest of Wales, stretching from the Prehistoric uplands to the indented coasts of Cardigan Bay and Sprides Bay. Here, the sea mattered as much as the land. Deep inlets, sheltered harbors, and headlands shaped movement and power. A ruler who controlled the approaches around St. David's Head, Fishguard, and the natural harbor of Milford Haven influenced routes that reached far beyond local valleys. Tides and winds set the rhythm of politics as surely as harvests. Sea travel made neighbors feel closer than inland rivals. A voyage across the Irish Sea could be quicker than a journey through the Cambrian hills. This pulled Dyfed into maritime networks that linked it to Ireland and Western Britain. Goods moved by boat, metalwork, glass beads, cloth, and with them traveled news, clerics, and alliances. Courts valued sailors and pilots alongside mounted retainers. Promontory sites doubled as lookout points and gathering places where traders, monks, and envoys met under shared protection. Irish influence left visible marks. Personal names with Irish forms appear in early genealogies, and Ogham-inscribed stones stand at churchyards and track junctions. These bilingual markers reflect more than passing contact. Settlers from across the sea integrated into local elites through marriage, fosterage, and service, blending traditions rather than replacing them. Law and custom absorbed these connections, producing a political culture comfortable with cross-channel ties. Because the coast was central, Dyfed invested in anchorages and short overland routes linking shore to interior estates. Control focused on coves, beacons, and storehouses rather than high inland fortifications. Landing places generated dues and tolls, providing steady income. Disputes often centered on harbor rights, trading privileges, and marriage contracts with seafaring families, not only on pasture and cattle. When inland threats arose, allies could arrive by sea within days, changing the balance of response. Christian institutions flourished early. Coastal monasteries and church sites managed land, preserved texts, and trained scribes. Bishops advised rulers, blessed agreements, and maintained links with learning centers in Ireland and Western Britain. Burial near these sites reinforced status and continuity. Latin literacy persisted here with unusual strength, allowing charters and genealogies to be recorded with care, an advantage in a region of mixed lineages. Compared with kingdoms exposed to the eastern marches, Dyfed experienced longer periods of stability. Farms near river mouths produced grain and cattle for exchange, while uplands supplied wool and hides. Crafts developed in this steadier environment, and estates tied to church foundations expanded slowly. Many elites likely spoke both Welsh and Irish, a practical skill in courts that managed cross-sea relationships. Openness, however, carried risk. The same harbors that welcomed traders could admit raiders. Headlands that guided friendly sails also marked targets for hostile ones. As new seafaring powers learned the routes of the Irish Sea, Dyfed's habit of looking outward would be tested, and the waters that once brought connection would soon bring conflict. Viking interest in Wales developed later than in eastern Britain. The coast offered fewer deep river highways, and the interior was defended by power centers used to rapid mobilization. Rocky headlands and exposed shores complicated landings, while Welsh rulers already maintained watchpoints and musters along familiar routes. Distance also mattered. Most raiding fleets approached from Irish bases, making voyages dependent on weather, season, and favorable winds. These limits reduced the appeal of early large-scale settlement. When Scandinavian crews did arrive, they focused on speed and profit rather than occupation. Coastal communities, island monasteries, and river mouths offered valuables that could be seized quickly and converted into silver. Monasteries were especially vulnerable. They stored food, metalwork, manuscripts, and portable wealth, and they often lay near good anchorages. Short, violent strikes fit crews who needed to withdraw before local forces gathered. Anglesey became a recurring target. Its fertile fields produced grain and cattle, and its position in the Irish Sea opened routes linking Ireland, the Isle of Man, and the North Welsh coast. A force that established even a temporary foothold could raid inland, resupply, or trade before moving on. Pressure on the Men-Ai Strait rippled into mainland politics, forcing rulers to divert attention from rivalries to coastal defense. Welsh responses varied. Some rulers met attacks with force, assembling ships and warbands to contest landings at beaches and river mouths. Others made temporary use of raiders, hiring them as mercenaries or buying time through payment and market access. These arrangements were pragmatic and short-lived. A fleet might trade peacefully one season and raid the next, depending on opportunity and resistance. Loyalty was never assumed. Trade followed the same routes as violence. Silver became a common measure of exchange, and portable goods moved through harbors tied to raiding activity. Weights and scales appear in archaeological finds, showing regular commercial dealings alongside conflict. Crews that sold furs, metalwork, or imported goods could use the same coves that hosted armed landings weeks earlier. Coastal Wales lived with a blurred line between threat and opportunity. As danger increased, defenses adapted. Promontory sites gained earthworks or timber reinforcements, and beacon systems linked headlands into early warning networks. Inland communities prepared refuges, hilltops, enclosed churchyards, and lake-edge sites where access could be controlled. Storehouses shifted away from exposed shores. The familiar geography of ridges and routes supported layered responses. Delay at the coast, signal inland, regroup at secure nodes. The archaeological record reflects this dual world. Viking silver hoards found in Wales include coins, ingots, and cut metal buried in landscapes shaped by both exchange and fear. Such deposits suggest moments of uncertainty, wealth hidden quickly when rumors spread or alliances broke. Communities learned to balance gain against risk. Sustained pressure encouraged firmer internal organization. Courts clarified obligations for ship service, harbor dues, and defense. Law helped manage tribute and responsibility, tying people to watch duties and repair work. Central authority became a practical necessity, not an abstraction. Out of this environment, rulers who could regulate trade, law, and defense together gained advantage, preparing Wales for a new phase of consolidation. After decades shaped by raids and shifting alliances, the early 10th century offered a rare pause. Borders still moved, but more slowly. Inheritance linked scattered territories, and marriages connected courts that had once fought seasonally. Warfare did not vanish, but it became selective, used to settle disputes rather than to devastate entire regions. This calmer rhythm created space for consolidation, and within it one ruler rose who governed through agreement as much as force. That ruler was Hywel Dda. Through inheritance, marriage, diplomacy, and limited campaigns, he assembled control over much of southwest and central Wales, later extending influence into the north. His authority did not depend on permanent garrisons planted in hostile land. Instead, he left local elites in place, demanding tribute, service, and recognition of his senior status. Power flowed through cooperation, reinforced by the credible threat of force rather than constant violence. Hywel's most enduring legacy was legal rather than military. Under his patronage, assemblies of jurists and clerics recorded Welsh customary law and shaped it into an organized system. These laws emphasized compensation over retribution. Detailed schedules fixed the value of injuries, theft, and damage, allowing disputes to end with payment and pledges instead of feuds. Procedures defined who could speak for a kin group, how sureties worked, and when oaths carried legal force. Judgment balanced status, relationship, and context. Law reached deeply into daily life. Rules governed landholding, common pasture, and boundary disputes. Inheritance divided property among sons while recognizing obligations created through fosterage and acknowledged relationships. Marriage law set out dowry rights, separation terms, and compensation for injury to honor. Criminal acts carried fines scaled to rank, from king to bondman. The system aimed at predictability, giving communities a clear path from grievance to settlement. Christian institutions strengthened this framework. Bishops and monastic communities preserved literacy, trained scribes, and hosted assemblies. Hywel granted land and protection to churches, securing prayers, legitimacy, and administrative support. Church calendars provided regular occasions for courts, and sacred sites lent moral weight to rulings. Cooperation between ruler and clergy helped keep legal practice consistent across regions with strong local habits. Welsh law also marked difference. Compared with neighboring systems that favored execution or mutilation, it stressed restitution and social balance. That distinction reinforced identity. Being Welsh meant resolving conflict through measured compensation rather than irreversible punishment. One feature stood out even in a European context. Women held defined rights in marriage and property, including claims to goods on separation and protections tied to honor and dowry. Hywel's death loosened the bonds he had maintained. Lands divided among heirs, regional rulers reasserted autonomy, and the absence of a central broker revived rivalry. Yet the legal structure endured. Manuscripts circulated, courts continued to apply custom, and the idea that law could unite Wales outlived the man who had given it form, shaping politics long after his authority faded. After Hywel Dda, authority fractured back into regional hands. Law codes remained in use, copied and cited in courts, but no single ruler could enforce them across all Wales. Kingship divided among dynastic branches, each claiming legitimacy through ancestry, church backing, or success in war. The political landscape became a shifting mosaic of principalities. Gwynedd, Dyfed, Powys, and smaller lordships, whose fortunes rose and fell with individual rulers rather than enduring institutions. Power moved through family ties as much as force. Marriage could secure a valley as effectively as a campaign, while fosterage created bonds that complicated succession. A prince might inherit land only to face challenge from a cousin raised in a rival court. These kin networks produced constant negotiation. Disputes were settled through arbitration when possible, but when talks failed, violence followed, often limited, seasonal, and targeted rather than destructive. Warfare during this period favored mobility. Raids for cattle, hostages, and tribute mattered more than decisive battles. Winter attacks aimed at fodder stores could weaken an opponent more effectively than open combat. Sieges focused on timber halls or small strongholds that controlled storage and routes, not on annihilating armies. Alliances formed quickly and dissolved just as fast depending on timing, harvests, and opportunity. Into this environment stepped Gwynedd ap Llywelyn, who forced a break from the pattern. Over roughly 2 decades, he defeated rival Welsh rulers and imposed authority across much of the country. He combined control of key passes, river crossings, and food-producing regions with relentless campaigning. By disrupting rivals' supply and denying them allies, he absorbed their territories into a single realm that demanded tribute and service. Gwyned's reach extended eastward as well. He confronted English earls along the borderlands, attacking forts that controlled river corridors and negotiating from a position of strength. For a time, English rulers treated him as a peer because he could field comparable force and manage the frontier at scale. This was not symbolic unity. It rested on constant pressure, trusted lieutenants, and the ability to move men and resources efficiently. That unity proved fragile. Gruffudd's death in 1063 removed the central figure holding rivalries in check. Territory splintered along old family claims, and neighboring rulers rushed to reclaim lost ground. Without a single authority to arbitrate disputes, the balance tipped outward. The collapse coincided with a far larger shift beyond the border, one that would change the nature of power itself. In 1066, England fell to the Normans. New lords arrived with different methods: stone fortifications, heavy cavalry, and a culture of permanent conquest. Welsh politics, long shaped by kinship and seasonal war, now faced an opponent who built to stay. The age of the princes closed not with resolution, but with pressure mounting from a transformed frontier that would soon test every kingdom in Wales. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 shifted the balance of power west almost immediately. New rulers needed land, revenue, and strategic depth, and the valleys of the Wye, Severn, and Dee offered clear routes into Wales. Royal attention was uneven in the early years, as England itself still required consolidation, but ambitious earls along the frontier did not wait. They brought heavy cavalry, engineers, and a culture of fortification that treated land as something to be permanently held rather than seasonally contested. Advance came in bursts rather than a single sweep. Norman forces tested the border with probing raids, then consolidated gains by establishing strongpoints where resistance was weakest. River crossings, fertile lowlands, and coastal inlets became priority targets because supply determined survival. One valley might see a new fort and a planted garrison, while the next remained under Welsh control. Summer allowed building and campaigning. Winter forced consolidation, turning each captured site into a question of endurance rather than momentum. Castles became the engine of conquest. Motte and Bailey fortifications could be erected in days using earth, timber, and local labor. A steep mound supported a tower. Below it, a fenced bailey housed troops, horses, workshops, and stores. Even when built entirely of wood, these castles transformed the balance of power. A small garrison could dominate surrounding land, raid livestock, enforce tolls, and retreat behind defenses before a larger Welsh force could gather. Stone would come later. The immediate shock lay in speed and placement. Along the border, a distinct form of warfare developed. Norman lords acted with wide autonomy, launching private campaigns, negotiating truces, and building castles without direct royal oversight. Rewards were substantial. Land grants, toll rights, and judicial authority encouraged constant expansion. Power flowed outward from the castle rather than inward from any centralized administration. Where a fort stood, its lord claimed authority over markets, mills, and courts, reshaping local life around military needs. Welsh rulers adapted to this pressure. They avoided open battles where cavalry held advantage, and instead relied on ambush, night attacks, and harassment of supply lines. Fighters moved along wooded ridges and narrow passes, striking work parties and convoys. When a castle could not be taken, its supporting countryside became the target. Farms were burned, livestock driven off, and outlying posts destroyed, turning fortified sites into isolated islands that consumed resources without securing loyalty. Despite these advances, Norman control remained fragmented. Lowlands and border towns felt the new order quickly. Markets taxed, mills regulated, churches tied to continental patrons, while upland interiors largely remained Welsh. Steep terrain, sparse population, and limited surplus restricted how far garrisons could project power. Many districts acknowledged Norman authority only during active campaigns, then slipped back into native rule once pressure eased. The result was not conquest, but transformation. The border hardened into a militarized zone of castles, raids, negotiations, and shifting allegiance. Neither side achieved total dominance. Instead, a new frontier culture emerged, one that rewarded fortification, private war, and permanent presence. Out of this environment would grow a powerful class of lords whose authority reshaped Wales for generations. The Norman advance did not settle into a fixed border. Instead, it produced a class of frontier rulers whose power exceeded normal feudal limits. These were the Marcher lords. By royal grant and long-standing custom, they exercised authority in their territories that elsewhere belonged to the crown. They held courts that judged life and death, raised armies without royal permission, built castles at will, and kept the profits of conquest. Their task was simple in principle: push west, hold what they took, and pay the crown only when convenient. Each Marcher lordship functioned as a compact state. The lord's castle served as court, treasury, and military base. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and judges answered directly to him, not to any English county system. Law blended Norman practice with local custom where it proved useful, creating hybrid systems designed to extract revenue and enforce control rather than preserve tradition. Lords could declare war, seize land, and execute criminals without reference to Westminster. Power rested on proximity, force, and permanence. Castle building drove expansion. Timber fortifications secured early gains, then stone replaced wood as wealth increased. Keeps rose at river crossings, on valley spurs, and above market towns. Curtain walls enclosed space for garrisons, workshops, and granaries. Roads bent to pass beneath archery range. Mills, bridges, and ferries became sources of tolls. Settlement followed fortification, planned villages, new field systems, and churches tied to continental orders spread under the protection of walls. Military success hardened into economic structure. By the mid-12th century, Marcher castles dotted much of eastern and southern Wales. Some overlooked fertile lowlands. Others dominated narrow passes that controlled movement between uplands and coast. From these sites, lords levied rents, enforced markets, and demanded service. Valleys reorganized around garrison needs: fodder, timber, lime, carts, and labor. Even when castles were not actively contested, their presence reshaped daily life. Welsh rulers responded with a mix of resistance and accommodation. Some launched coordinated assaults on isolated mottes after good harvests boosted manpower. Others negotiated truces that traded pasture access or hostages for breathing space. Marriages linked Marcher halls and Welsh courts, creating temporary alliances that slowed conflict without ending it. These arrangements were unstable. A wedding could buy peace for a season. A raid might follow the next year when advantage shifted. The result was not a clean division, but a mosaic. One valley answered to a Marcher lord, the next remained under a Welsh prince. A third paid dues to whichever force arrived first after shearing. Jurisdictions overlapped, and tenants learned to navigate multiple legal systems. Crucially, Marcher lords possessed rights that elsewhere required royal authority. Their lordships became semi-independent powers, shaping politics on both sides of the frontier. As these private states pressed deeper into Wales, the cost of disunity rose. Seasonal resistance could no longer undo permanent fortification. The logic of the marches forced a reckoning. Either Welsh rulers pooled resources and coordinated policy, or they faced steady erosion. Out of this pressure emerged leaders who argued not just for survival, but for unity strong enough to confront castles with sustained power. Owain ap Glyndwr came to power at a moment when Wales felt compressed from all sides. Norman castles pressed inward from the marches, rival Welsh dynasties contested inheritance, and older alliances no longer held. Taking the throne of Gwynedd in 1137, he inherited not just territory but a problem. Survival now required more than seasonal resistance. Owain turned that pressure into leverage, reshaping the north into a base strong enough to project power rather than merely absorb attacks. His first priority was consolidation. He secured Anglesey, tightened control over the Lôn Peninsula, and treated the Men-ai Strait as both barrier and highway. By controlling crossings and coastal approaches, he denied Marcher lords easy access to the north. Inland, he reinforced authority along the Conwy and Clwyd valleys, key corridors that outsiders had long used to probe Gwynedd's interior. Castles that once threatened expansion now faced isolation, their supply lines strained by constant harassment. Owain's campaigns favored persistence over spectacle. Rather than decisive clashes, he applied steady pressure. Harvests were disrupted, rebuilding was forced again and again, and Marcher treasuries were drained by the need to maintain garrisons under constant threat. Welsh forces struck quickly, withdrew into terrain that favored them, and returned before opponents could regroup. Over time, this rhythm slowed Norman expansion and, in some districts, reversed it. Inside Gwynedd, authority became more coherent. Local chiefs retained status, but decision-making aligned increasingly with the royal court. Household troops formed a reliable core, and tribute flowed with greater regularity. Clerics and jurists played growing roles in council, helping frame rulings in ways that emphasized continuity and legitimacy. Gwynedd began to function less as a loose federation and more as a dynastic state with expectations that outlived any single campaign. Owain reinforced that authority culturally as well as militarily. He upheld Welsh law in disputes, favored arbitration grounded in native custom, and patronized poets who celebrated lineage, land rights, and lawful rule. These were not ornaments. Poetry and genealogy carried political weight, broadcasting claims of legitimacy and binding elites to a shared narrative of resistance and order. The message was clear: Gwynedd governed by right, not by permission. His refusal to acknowledge English overlordship marked a turning point. Where earlier rulers had bent pragmatically, Owain asserted independence openly. That stance resonated beyond his borders. Other Welsh rulers negotiated harder, resisted longer, and timed their actions to coincide with northern pressure. The idea that Norman advance was inevitable lost credibility. By the time of his death in 1170, Owain had reshaped the balance of power. He did not unify Wales outright, but he demonstrated that sustained coordination, rooted in geography, law, and dynastic authority, could hold back the marches. The structures he strengthened, territorial control, legal identity, and centralized leadership, would pass to successors with broader ambitions, setting the stage for a renewed push toward unity under a different name. Llywelyn ap Iorwerth came to power in a fractured north. After Owain Gwyned's death, internal rivalry weakened the dynasty, and Marcher lords exploited the divisions. Llywelyn began his career fighting cousins rather than foreigners, reclaiming strongholds along the Conwy and asserting authority valley by valley. Early victories mattered less for territory than for credibility. By proving he could hold ground and reward loyalty, he rebuilt the core of Gwynedd before turning outward. His approach blended force with restraint. Campaigns were followed by settlements that fixed gains into durable control. Hostages secured compliance, oaths formalized hierarchy, and limited garrisons protected key sites without overextending resources. Llywelyn replaced unreliable allies with men dependent on his favor, yet he avoided dismantling local elites entirely. Stability came from inclusion under clear supremacy rather than constant replacement. The result was steadier tribute, predictable service, and an army that could mobilize quickly with secure supply. Marriage became a political instrument. Llywelyn tied himself to powerful Welsh houses and, crucially, to the English royal family. These unions did not end conflict, but they altered its terms. A Marcher lord was no longer just a neighbor, he might be kin. Disputes now carried diplomatic weight, and aggression risked wider consequences. Kinship widened Llywelyn's leverage beyond what arms alone could provide. Relations with the English crown reflected this balance. Llywelyn negotiated from strength during moments when English kings faced rebellion or financial strain. Treaties recognized his authority over much of Wales and acknowledged him as a dominant ruler rather than a subordinate lord. Such recognition mattered because it constrained Marcher aggression and forced negotiations through the crown. Written agreements turned military advantage into legal standing. Inside Gwynedd, governance tightened. Llywelyn enforced Welsh law consistently, appointing judges and standardizing court practice. Disputes that once triggered retaliation now ended with fines and settlements, reducing internal friction. Succession planning received unusual attention. Heirs were designated early, rivals managed through custody or alliance, and fragmentation delayed. Charters multiplied, clerical record-keeping expanded, and authority became visible not only in war but in routine administration. Against the Marcher lords, Llywelyn chose targets carefully. He attacked castles that anchored valleys, pressured garrisons into terms, and made peace expensive to break. Even when territory did not change hands permanently, the balance shifted. Marcher expansion slowed, resources drained, and their room for independent action narrowed. By the height of his rule, Llywelyn exercised primacy across much of Wales. He did not govern every district directly, but his consent mattered everywhere. His death in 1240 left behind stronger institutions than any Welsh ruler before him, yet it also exposed a familiar risk. Without the architect, the structure could be tested. England would soon probe whether Llywelyn's achievements rested on foundations deep enough to endure. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd inherited ambition rather than stability. After the death of Llywelyn the Great, Gwynedd fractured under competing claims, weakened by internal rivalry and renewed Marcher pressure. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd emerged from this struggle by defeating his own kin, reclaiming strongholds along the Conwy, and rebuilding a core realm capable of sustained action. Control of Anglesy's grain and the mountain roots of Eryri restored the economic base needed to field troops and reward loyalty. From this position, he expanded influence without attempting direct occupation everywhere. Campaigns targeted strategic points, passes, river crossings, and administrative centers, followed by settlements that imposed tribute, hostages, and recognition of his seniority. Local rulers retained authority, but now answered to him. This layered control conserved resources while extending reach, allowing Llywelyn to shape politics across much of Wales without garrisoning every district. His claim went beyond force. Llywelyn asserted the title Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, presenting himself as the rightful leader of a unified Welsh polity. Law, church patronage, and diplomacy reinforced the claim. Clerics supported his authority, courts applied Welsh law under his name, and agreements framed resistance as lawful defense rather than rebellion. The title mattered because it demanded recognition from both Welsh rulers and the English crown. That recognition came, conditionally, with the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267. The English king acknowledged Llywelyn's title and authority over other Welsh rulers, but tied that authority to homage and defined obligations. On parchment, it was a triumph. In practice, it bound Welsh unity to English approval. Llywelyn gained status, but at the cost of increased scrutiny and reduced freedom of action. Relations deteriorated under Edward I. Edward demanded tighter compliance, expanded Marcher rights, and pressed Llywelyn to accept marriages and alliances on English terms. Llywelyn resisted, seeing each concession as erosion of independence. Diplomatic deadlock turned into military confrontation. English forces advanced from multiple directions, combining Marcher contingents with royal armies and naval supply along the coast. Welsh strategy relied on familiar strengths: mountain strongholds, mobile forces, and control of narrow routes. For a time, these tactics slowed progress. But the scale of English resources changed the balance. Campaigns extended longer, supply lines held, and coastal pressure weakened Gwyned's maritime shield. Internal divisions resurfaced as some Welsh leaders sought security through submission, draining Llywelyn's support. Defeats narrowed his authority step by step. Territory was lost, hostages surrendered, and allies peeled away. In 1282, Llywelyn was killed in battle, his death symbolizing more than personal loss. It marked the end of native princely rule capable of negotiating as an equal power. Resistance continued briefly, but without a central figure, it lacked leverage. What followed was not immediate silence, but inevitability. English administration moved in behind armies, castles replaced negotiation, and the political space that had allowed Welsh rulers to maneuver collapsed. With Llywelyn's fall, the struggle shifted from diplomacy and balance to outright conquest, ushering in a final decisive phase in Wales's medieval history. Edward I approached Wales not as a border problem, but as a project. Where earlier kings relied on Marcher initiative and seasonal campaigns, Edward planned sustained conquest. Relations with Llywelyn ap Gruffudd had broken down over homage, borders, and authority, and Edward treated each dispute as justification for escalation. The first campaign in 1277 established the method: concentrate force, secure supply, demand submission, and keep pressure constant until resistance narrowed to manageable pockets. Edward committed resources on a scale Wales had not faced before. Royal revenues funded large armies, contract troops, and specialists, engineers, masons, carpenters, shipmasters. Administration tracked wages, food, timber, and stone. Campaigns no longer depended on local plunder alone. Instead, supply depots and coastal shipping allowed armies to operate for extended periods. Wales became a theater of war organized from above, not a frontier left to improvisation. Operations advanced in coordinated stages. Columns moved from Chester, the Marches, and the south, while fleets supported the north coast. Rivers and estuaries became supply arteries rather than obstacles. Grain, salted meat, and siege equipment arrived by ship, denying Welsh defenders the time advantage they once relied on. Roads were cleared, bridges repaired, and labor gangs hauled materials under guard. Edward's armies did not need to win quickly. They needed to keep moving. Castles anchored conquest. Edward ordered a chain of stone fortresses across North Wales, Flint and Rhuddlan first, followed by Conwy, Caernarfon, and Harlech. These were not simple keeps. They were massive, planned structures with curtain walls, towers, water gates, and integrated towns. Each castle controlled surrounding territory and secured supply by sea. Even if inland routes closed, the garrison could hold. The architecture itself signaled permanence and royal authority. After Llywelyn's death in 1282, resistance fragmented. Dyfed ap Gruffudd continued the fight, but without unified leadership, Welsh forces struggled to coordinate timing and resources. One stronghold fell while another waited for aid that never arrived. English commanders isolated districts, starved defenders, or bypassed resistance entirely, tightening control valley by valley. Capture replaced negotiation, and terms grew harsher as options narrowed. Conquest concluded with law. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 reorganized Wales under the English crown. Royal officials replaced native rulers in key areas, English courts extended jurisdiction, and revenues were redirected to maintain garrisons and administration. Some local customs survived, but authority now flowed through sheriffs, justiciars, and written procedure. Governance followed conquest rather than preceding it. Edward's castle program ranked among the most expensive military enterprises in medieval Europe. The investment reshaped daily life. New towns grew under castle walls, markets shifted, and movement followed guarded routes. At the same time, resentment hardened. Dispossession, settlement policies, and the use of law to enforce conquest left scars that did not fade with peace. By 1283, Wales was no longer a negotiating partner. It was a conquered land administered through stone, statute, and standing garrisons. The age of princes ended not with a treaty between equals, but with a system designed to prevent their return, one that would shape resistance and identity for centuries to come. By the end of the 14th century, Resentment toward English rule had settled into everyday experience. Welsh law had been displaced by English courts, taxation-supported wars fought elsewhere, and land disputes increasingly favored settlers tied to royal authority. Town charters privileged English burgesses, while Welsh communities nearby faced legal and economic disadvantage. These pressures accumulated quietly across generations, creating a climate where protest no longer needed a grand cause, only a catalyst. That catalyst was Owain Glyndwr, a minor noble of the borderlands with experience in English law and service. A local land dispute with a powerful neighbor escalated when royal institutions failed to protect his claim. What began as a personal grievance quickly widened. Support gathered along kinship lines and local networks. And by 1400, Glyndwr stood at the center of a rising that spread faster than officials anticipated. The revolt gained momentum when communities proclaimed him Prince of Wales. The title mattered. It transformed resistance into a political program centered on restoring Welsh law, reducing taxation, and reclaiming autonomy in church and governance. Support came from rural households, members of the native gentry, and clerics who saw English control as both unjust and culturally corrosive. Uprisings followed familiar routes: river valleys, market circuits, and family alliances, allowing news and coordination to move quickly. Welsh forces avoided open confrontation. Small bands targeted convoys, isolated garrisons, and administrative centers, then melted into hills and woodland. Guides chose routes that frustrated pursuit and relied on hidden stores for supply. When English armies assembled, resistance dispersed rather than stood. This strategy stretched the conflict beyond the campaigning seasons that usually decided medieval wars. At its height, the revolt disrupted English authority across large areas. Towns and castles fell or changed hands, and coastal routes were contested, complicating supply. Officials abandoned posts, and in some districts, Welsh courts resumed under native custom. English power did not collapse, but it no longer felt secure. Resources had to be diverted repeatedly, weakening control elsewhere. Glyndwr sought to turn rebellion into international conflict. He pursued alliances with France and Scotland, framing Wales as part of a broader struggle against English dominance. French support brought promises, limited forces, and strategic coordination, while diplomatic outreach signaled that the revolt aimed at sovereignty, not concession. Glyndwr also outlined plans for Welsh institutions, a parliament, an independent church hierarchy, and centers of learning. That suggested a vision beyond warfare. The balance shifted as England regrouped. Commanders applied sustained pressure, rotating forces and reinforcing garrisons. Harsh winters and failed harvests strained Welsh support, and some leaders accepted pardons to protect estates. Without consistent foreign aid, resistance thinned. By 1415, organized revolt had faded, and Glyndwr disappeared from record, his fate unknown. Though defeated, the rebellion left a lasting imprint. It exposed the costs of conquest, revived the idea of Welsh self-rule, and embedded Glyndwr as a symbol of national resistance. The institutions he imagined did not survive his lifetime, but the memory of a Wales that could claim sovereignty endured, shaping how later generations understood loss, identity, and the possibility of renewal. The end of the Wars of the Roses brought a dynasty to the English throne with deep Welsh roots. In 1485, Henry VT secured the crown, and his ancestry carried symbolic weight west of the border. For Welsh elites long excluded from power, the accession of a king who could trace descent through Welsh lineages suggested a shift in fortune. Loyalty to the new regime offered opportunity rather than suspicion, and many gentry families aligned themselves eagerly with Tudor authority. Henry VIII rewarded that support through stability more than transformation. He strengthened royal justice, curtailed private warfare, and bound powerful families to the crown through bonds and offices. Welsh gentlemen entered royal service as sheriffs, household officials, and military officers. In return, the crown expected order along the frontier and reliable collection of revenue. The borderlands quieted not because grievances vanished, but because rebellion no longer promised advantage. Whose government favored uniformity over accommodation. The laws in Wales Acts dismantled the remaining legal distinctions between Wales and England. Welsh territories were reorganized into counties governed by English-style courts, sheriffs, and justices of the peace. Separate legal traditions lost standing, and English law became the sole framework for administration, property, and crime. These changes reshaped everyday governance. Court business shifted fully into English procedure, and written pleadings followed standardized forms unfamiliar to many Welsh speakers. Local customs survived informally, but public authority now operated in a language and system increasingly distant from ordinary life. Officials enforced new expectations consistently, replacing the negotiated flexibility of earlier centuries with predictable but impersonal rule. Political integration followed legal reform. Welsh counties sent representatives to the English Parliament, creating a formal channel for influence at the center. Ambitious families pursued careers through law, landholding, and office rather than through military leadership. Service at court and in Parliament offered security and advancement that rebellion no longer could. Over time, loyalty to the crown became a route to prosperity. The cultural cost was significant. The Acts barred the Welsh language from official use, excluding most native speakers from public office and legal participation. English became the language of power, while Welsh retreated to homes, chapels, and poetry. This division hardened social boundaries even as political integration deepened. Wales was no longer governed separately, but it was not culturally absorbed. Yet Welsh identity adapted rather than vanished. Poets preserved history and lineage. Chapel life sustained language and education. Local memory carried older law and custom even when statute displaced them. The Tudor settlement closed the era of open rebellion and native rule, replacing it with incorporation into a larger state. From this point on, Welsh resistance and ambition would work largely within the system, not against it. The union forged in the 16th century proved durable. It bound Wales to England administratively and politically, ending centuries of frontier warfare. At the same time, it planted a long tension between governance and culture, one that would resurface whenever economic change or political reform reopened the question of how Wales fit within the state that now claimed it fully. From the 18th century onward, Wales was reshaped by minerals, water, and steam. Coal seams lay close to the surface, iron ore sat within reach of fuel, and fast-flowing rivers powered early industry. What had once been rural valleys and upland pastures became sites of extraction and manufacture. Change arrived unevenly at first. Charcoal ironworks, small pits, water-driven mills. But each success attracted capital, labor, and infrastructure that accelerated the process. The South Wales coalfield grew into one of the most productive industrial regions in the world. Collieries multiplied along valley floors, first shallow and later driven deep underground. Tramroads evolved into railways, linking pits to ports at Cardiff, Newport, and Swansea. From there, coal shipped across Britain and overseas, feeding factories, steamships, and navies. By the 19th century, Welsh coal powered global trade and imperial expansion, tying local labor to distant markets. Ironmaking followed a similar arc. Early furnaces relied on local ore and charcoal. Later works adopted coke, allowing far greater scale. Rolling mills produced rails, plates, and beams for railways, bridges, and ships. As steelmaking spread, integrated plants combined furnaces, converters, and mills in single complexes. Towns expanded around these works with rows of company housing, chapels, schools, and shops rising close to gates and slag heaps. Work schedules replaced agricultural rhythms, and industrial noise defined daily life. In the north, slate transformed mountainsides. Quarries carved terraces into rock faces, extracting slab split and dressed by skilled crews. Inclines and tramways carried slate to ports along the Menai Strait, from which it spread across Britain and beyond. Welsh slate roofed factories, houses, and civic buildings, embedding the labor of quarrymen into landscapes far from their own. Communities formed around quarry culture, where skill, danger, and collective discipline shaped identity. Industrial growth drew people in. Rural families moved into valleys while migrants arrived from England, Ireland, and farther afield. Settlements swelled into dense towns with rail stations, gas lighting, and piped water. Lodging houses and terraces crowded close to work sites. Newspapers circulated widely, choirs flourished, and education expanded through Sunday schools and mechanics institutes. Population growth brought opportunity, but also overcrowding and strain. Work was hazardous. Mining accidents, explosions, and disease were common. Furnaces demanded relentless labor. Wages rose and fell with markets, forcing families to pool income across ages and trades. In response, workers organized. Trade unions, benefit societies, and federations negotiated pay, hours, and safety. Strikes and mass meetings became regular features of political life, turning industrial valleys into centers of collective action. Nonconformist chapels anchored these communities. They provided moral structure, education, and social space. The Welsh language thrived in sermons, hymnody, and public meetings, shaping political debate and labor activism. Chapel and Union Hall often overlapped, binding faith, literacy, and reform into a shared culture that resisted complete assimilation. By the 20th century, the system strained. Markets shifted, seams thinned, and global competition intensified. pits and works closed or consolidated, leaving communities dependent on a shrinking industrial base. Wales entered the modern era carrying the institutions, solidarities, and scars forged in the age of coal and steel. Assets and burdens that would shape how it faced economic decline and political change. At the turn of the 20th century, Wales stood industrially powerful but socially strained. Coal, steel, and slate still drove employment, yet margins were tightening and labor disputes growing sharper. Communities that had expanded rapidly in the 19th century now lived with overcrowding, dangerous work, and economic volatility. Beneath the surface of industrial success, pressure was building. Pressure that war would expose and accelerate. The First World War pulled Wales directly into a global conflict. Tens of thousands enlisted from mining valleys and industrial towns, while coal and steel became strategic resources. Welsh ports moved fuel and materials critical to the war effort, tying local labor to national survival. The cost was heavy. Casualties hit tightly knit communities hard, and returning soldiers faced an economy already shifting under strain. The war disrupted markets, unsettled labor relations, and weakened the assumption that industry alone guaranteed security. The interwar years deepened the crisis. Global demand fell, exports collapsed, and unemployment soared in industrial districts. Entire valleys experienced long-term joblessness, not seasonal downturns. Families survived through informal economies, migration, and mutual aid. Hunger marches and protests expressed frustration, not just with employers, but with a political system that seemed distant from daily hardship. Faith in laissez-faire economics eroded rapidly. Out of this hardship emerged a new political alignment. Labor politics took firm root in Wales, drawing strength from trade unions, chapels, and working-class communities. Attention shifted from landowners and industrialists to MPs who spoke the language of labor rights, welfare, and collective responsibility. Politics became less about local patronage and more about national solutions to structural problems. The Second World War intensified these trends. Once again, Welsh industry became essential. Coal-fueled fleets in factories, steel-armed armies, and ports served as logistical hubs. Air raids struck industrial towns, bringing the war directly home. Evacuees arrived from English cities, changing the social fabric of rural and coastal areas. Wartime planning expanded the state's role in housing, health, and employment, demonstrating that coordinated intervention could stabilize lives. The war's end marked a decisive shift. The post-war settlement rejected the idea that communities should absorb economic collapse alone. Policies introduced universal health care, expanded education, social security, and public housing. For Wales, these changes were transformative. Regions long exposed to industrial risk now had guaranteed access to medical care and income support. The state became a permanent presence in everyday life, not just an emergency responder. This new relationship mattered culturally as well as economically. Welsh communities that had relied on chapel, union, and kin networks now interacted with national institutions that recognized collective need. Expectations changed. Security, health, and opportunity were no longer favors or accidents. They were rights. That belief would shape how Wales understood politics in the second half of the 20th century. By 1945, Wales was no longer just an industrial engine or a peripheral region. It had become a society deeply invested in collective provision and political representation. The foundations of modern Welsh political identity, social democratic, institutionally minded, and skeptical of distant authority, were laid not by nationalism alone, but by war, loss, and the promise that the state could be made to serve ordinary lives. The decline of heavy industry in the 20th century forced Wales to confront structural change on a national scale. Coal mines closed valley by valley, steelworks contracted or disappeared, and slate quarries fell silent. Communities built around single employers lost their economic anchors, and unemployment rose in waves. Younger workers left in search of opportunity, while those who stayed faced insecure work and shrinking public resources. Local councils struggled to respond as demand for services increased and tax bases narrowed. Out of this disruption, a more mixed economy emerged. Public services expanded to become major employers in health, education, and local government. Light manufacturing and logistics developed in targeted zones, often supported by state investment. Tourism and heritage grew in importance, drawing visitors to national parks, coastal paths, historic towns, and cultural festivals. Universities expanded their reach, training students for research, technology, and public service rather than extraction and heavy industry. None of these sectors replaced the old industries entirely, but together they reduced dependence on a single economic model. Cultural confidence increased alongside economic adjustment. Campaigns to protect and promote the Welsh language gained traction after World War II. Welsh medium education expanded, broadcasting in Welsh reached national audiences, and public signage reflected bilingual identity. These changes were not purely symbolic. They shaped access to employment, education, and public life, making language a practical component of citizenship rather than a private inheritance. Political pressure followed. Decisions affecting Welsh communities were increasingly made far from the valleys and towns they affected, and dissatisfaction with centralized governance grew. Nationalism developed as a constitutional argument rather than a revolutionary one. Plaid Cymru pressed for self-government through elections and policy debate, while unions, civic groups, and local campaigns called for control over health, education, and economic development. A narrow referendum in 1997 marked a turning point. Voters approved the creation of a devolved legislature, and in 1999 Senedd Cymru opened with limited powers. Initially focused on administration and secondary legislation, the institution evolved steadily. Subsequent reforms granted primary lawmaking authority in devolved fields, budgetary control, and responsibility for areas including health, education, transport, and the Welsh language. Devolution changed how policy was made. Health strategies reflected Welsh demographics and geography. Education reforms strengthened Welsh medium provision and reshaped curricula. Transport planning focused on valley networks and regional connectivity rather than national corridors alone. Language policy gained statutory backing, embedding bilingual standards across public bodies and services. Governance became closer to the communities it served, even as debates over funding and powers continued. Wales today operates within a shared state while maintaining distinct institutions. The balance between devolved authority and central control remains contested and dynamic. Yet Wales stands out as a country where a minority language holds legal status, where national policy is shaped locally, and where identity is expressed through everyday governance rather than periodic revolt. The long arc of Welsh history. From landscape-driven survival to industrial power and constitutional self-rule, ends not in resolution but in negotiation. Modern Wales is neither conquered nor separate, but self-aware. A nation shaped by its past, operating through law and institutions, and still defining how it fits within the larger political structures it helped to build. Wales had survived conquest, rebellion, industrial upheaval, and political reinvention, carrying its language, culture, and identity forward into the modern world. If you enjoyed this complete journey through Welsh history, subscribe for more deep dive documentaries that uncover how the past shaped the world we live in today.